everyone. Welcome to the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanity Institute's 4th annual Global Ideas Local Impact event, hosted by the Student Advisory Board to the Duke Human Rights Center. My name is Hannah, and I'm a current sophomore at Duke. I currently serve as the co-chair of the Student Advisory Board, along with Mary Aline Furton.
I'm Mary Aline. The Duke Human Rights Center brings together an interdisciplinary group of scholars, staff, and students to promote new understandings about human rights issues. Our goal is to foster collaborative and cross-disciplinary work and critical thinking about human rights in both global and local contexts, hence Global Ideas Local Impact.
The Student Advisory Board for the Duke Human Rights Center puts an emphasis on experiences that foster knowledge and promote action. This year, for example, the Student Advisory Board has met with environmental activists from around the world in connection with the Human Rights Center's annual environmental rights theme and hosted educational events open to the student body, such as a documentary screening on wrongful incarceration and a question and answer with the director of the North Carolina Justice Policy Center. The annual Global Ideas Local Impact Symposium is always a capstone event for the Student Advisory Board, and we love being able to bring home some of our inspiring alumni and showcase the work being done on campus today.
The Duke Human Rights Center is a defining part of the college experience of many Duke students. It extends our human rights education beyond ideas and theories to produce proximity and contact with the people who actually do human rights work and who need human rights protection. The Duke Human Rights Center helps shape the identities of students as human rights activists, promotes deeper connections with Durham, and asserts the critical importance of human rights as an advocacy, legal, and educational tool. On that note, I'm very pleased to introduce the co-director of the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, Professor Robin Kirk, who is going to help us open up our event today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Aline and Hannah, and thank you all for coming. This is my favorite event of the year, so I'm so pleased to be here yet again. I want to first thank everyone who helped bring this together, especially the Student Advisory Board, Mary Aline, Hannah, and Ibby, who is over there, among them, as well as Emily Stewart, who's always our rock in pulling these things together, as well as our work study students who also help us publicize this event. As early as April of 1948, so several months before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, Eleanor Roosevelt, who chaired the drafting committee, published an article entitled "The Promise of Human Rights." In this article, she wrote, "It seems to me most important that the Declaration be accepted by all member nations, not because they will immediately live up to all of its provisions, but because they ought to support the standards towards which the nations must henceforth aim." In a speech before the United Nations General Assembly later, she fearlessly suggested that the Declaration may well become the Magna Carta for all people everywhere. She and her colleagues knew in 1948 that it would take years to create the treaties and courts needed to enforce the Declaration. More importantly, Roosevelt passionately believed that people needed to learn about and understand these rights. For her, human rights, quote, "carry no weight unless the people know them, unless the people understand them, unless the people demand that they be lived." It takes much more than documents, agreements, laws, and courts to ensure that rights are respected. The human rights enterprise lives only, Roosevelt believed, when they live among people, are examined and used by people, something we strive to understand and implement in the lives of all people. At a speech at the United Nations several years later, Roosevelt said that human rights begin in small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood she lives in, the school or college she attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seek equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. This is very much the spirit of this event, as well as the spirit of the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute. We want to study human rights, we want to ask about human rights, we want to examine them, we want to criticize them, but we also want to learn about them and seek ways to apply them in ways that matter to people in those small places. And I think you will see in the projects that the students will talk about, as well as in the work of our distinguished alumni who've come back to talk about their careers and how human rights have animated their thinking about their working lives and their commitment to justice, how that human rights ideal doesn't just live in Geneva and doesn't just live in treaties, but it lives in people's homes, in people's communities, in people's neighborhoods. I want to just mention a couple of things, especially for the students here. We have a number of programs that we hope you take a look at. Some of the students that will be presenting today are part of these programs, including the Human Rights Certificate, which is like a kind of a minor you can take as part of your course of study here at Duke. It's open to any major. It can be combined with pretty much any major, and there's a number of students here who are completing the certificate, so I please urge you to, if you're interested, to please talk to me, talk to Emily, talk to one of the students about how to do that. We also have a deadline coming up, which is the deadline for the Claudia Kuntz Prize for Best Paper or Project in Human Rights, honoring one of our founding members, Dr. Claudia Kuntz, who's there in the back there, and honoring her father. And we have had such wonderful projects that have been submitted for the Kuntz Prize. So if you have a paper that you're especially proud of or a human rights related project, again, talk to me, talk to Emily, talk to one of the students to see how you might submit it. And I would also say we also have a program for next fall, and we have Libby over there who took it, Libby and maybe some other students, called Duke Immerse Rights and Identities, and we're still taking applications for that for the fall. That will be going to Mexico, and we are especially interested in looking at how human rights are seen through the lens of identity, and in particular, indigenous identity in Mexico. So if you are interested at all, please let me know. And let me throw it back to Mary Aline to introduce our panel.
You're welcome to come take some seats. Thank you. So we're really lucky today to have three distinguished alumni panelists with us. And you've set in order perfect. I'll go ahead and start at the head of the table and introduce them. So our first panelist is Damian DeNoble. He is a civil rights attorney and CivTech app developer. He's the co-founder of Mi Maritin, a Durham-based legal organization helping pioneer the development of tech-supported immigration legal defense. In 2016, he founded Bull City Lawyer, a private law firm that has a three-pronged focus on education, local advocacy, and vigorous representation. He also manages a YouTube channel, Immigrate, which provides information on navigating the immigration process. And he graduated from Trinity in 2007. So thank you for being here. Next is Karen Staus. Karen is Senior Policy Counsel at the U.S. Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division's Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit. She is the former Director of Programs for Free the Slaves, where she oversaw the organization's community-based anti-trafficking programs in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Ghana, Senegal, Haiti, Brazil, India, and Nepal. Prior to this position, she was the managing attorney of the Polaris Project, managing the provision of legal services to survivors of human trafficking, and directing the organization's policy advocacy efforts. She also opened and operated the Human Rights Watch field office in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. She holds a bachelor's degree from Duke University in 1996 and a JD from Columbia Law School. Thank you for being here. Great. And last but not least, we have James Tager, who is the Deputy Director of Free Expression Research and Policy at PEN America, where he manages the organization's research and advocacy surrounding free expression and press freedom domestically and internationally. Tager previously worked with the International Commission of Jurists in the Asia and Pacific program, first as a Satter Human Rights Fellow, and subsequently as an International Associate Legal Advisor, reporting on business and human rights issues including LGBT rights, environmental rights, and participatory rights for marginalized communities. Before that, he was a 2013-2014 Frederick Sheldon Traveling Fellow, researching civil society responses to the developing human rights framework within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Tager holds a BA from Duke University, class of 2009, and a JD from Harvard Law. Thanks for being here. And I'll bring our panel moderator up, Hannah, to start asking some questions. And feel free to start reflecting on some audience questions you'd like to throw out at the end. Thank you.
Welcome back to Duke, and thank you for being here. The first question is, what does the term human rights mean to you? How does the concept of human rights manifest in your work? And we can kind of go down a line here, or whenever you're ready, you can kind of jump in.
I can jump in. I think the concept of human rights, we all can refer to the definitions that now exist in international instruments. For me, it goes back to just some very core and very simple values that one person's pain is not less meaningful than another person's, and we all are equal in dignity. And so if one person is working 20 hours a week on a fishing vessel in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, it's not okay to say, well, that's because of the background that person comes from, and they're used to that, and that their separation from their family is just something that people from there are used to. That we realize that everyone, no matter what they look like or what culture they come from, has the same type of pain as we do, and that's what human rights is all about. It's trying to respect people's lives and take them out of those situations where they're being abused. We all have the same rights. So for me, it just goes back to very simple values. Long before I ever heard of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or any of the other instruments, just that idea of the Golden Rule.
I was hoping to go last so I could just steal from everyone else's answers. I also have been gravitating a lot recently towards the idea that you mentioned dignity, and I've been gravitating towards the idea that human rights is just a codification of human dignity. When I was in high school, I read somewhere that some historical figure carried a copy of the Constitution in his back pocket, and so I started carrying a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in my back pocket. Because but not really knowing what it said. Like, I still thought like the prohibition against shutting down cultural activities would keep me from being grounded. But that was my big laugh line, and no one went for it. So now I'm not feeling confident. I worked all night on that. Yeah, you got to call it out. But because I had the sense that human rights was some sort of useful framework for through which to filter my own sense of justice or injustice, and through which to filter my own sense of human dignity and how the world wasn't kind of meeting that. To this day, I think that's still how I tend to think of it.
Whenever a laugh line misses, whoa, you have to have a backup. You did a fine job there.
Yeah, it's a layered. It's a layered.
Human rights for me, like all of you, I received an initial grounding in kind of human rights theory here at Duke, and I was actually lucky enough to take my first human rights class ever with Professor Kuntz. I was a freshman, and the focus, and I think that kind of set me on a trajectory, and you'll hear more about her from me later. But for me, it's I tend to go with Amartya Sen's definition. It's a set of freedoms and protections extended to a human being that enables that person to be capable of creativity. When you're capable of creativity, that means that a lot of your, not just baseline needs, but secondary needs as a person to give you safety and the ability to think have been met. If you think about just studying in a library, if you think about the sort of privilege and safety that provides. In law school, I learned that the reason we tend to study well in libraries and other high-ceiling places is that's a place we don't feel like we're hiding. And when you're in a low-ceiling place, you feel a little anxious because maybe our reptilian brains think something's chasing us and have to stay in this deep, dark hole, right? But in a library, you have the space to be creative. But in exchange, I also think human rights has this parallel definition that we don't talk enough about today, which is in exchange for those rights, a person owns, and this is me, a reasonable set of duties to the society and other human beings that work to protect those rights that are given. And this is important, that reciprocal relationship. And the way that manifests in my work, I'm a civil rights attorney, right now I'm working in immigration, is I have a personal definition of rights that I believe a client or a detained individual needs to receive. And those rights are ones that I think I'm able to protect, right? I have to have a really clear definition of what those are. But I also have a set of expectations for my clients and detained individuals for what their duties are to help themselves. And this is a kind of important thing that I'll come back to, right, later on, I'm sure we'll touch upon, but you can't divide those two.
Thank you. The second question is, could you provide a general sense of what brought you into this field and your broader career path?
I would really like to answer this question and merge it with the fourth question, which is how did my undergraduate experience inform my career? Because in my case, I really do think that my time at Duke helped set me on the path toward human rights work. I have always had an interest as a teenager in social justice issues, and I think some of that started through, in my particular case, just a lot of reading, specifically about World War II history and the Holocaust. But by the time I arrived to Duke in 1992, during the time that I was here, the Rwandan genocide took place, the events in former Yugoslavia, and it was a stark time to realize that that wasn't the last time that a genocide had occurred. And I was very far away from it. I was on this campus. You've all had the experience. It feels very safe and feels very far away from anywhere that harm is happening. But my professor in a course I took my senior year called Genocide in the 20th Century really helped us get much closer to what was happening. And there was a lot of reflection during that time period about what it means to be a bystander. Well, sometimes being in a place like this makes you feel like a bystander, depending on what you're doing, because it is such a place of privilege. And I also identify myself as someone who comes from a background of privilege. And so the idea of being a bystander, I never thought I would ever commit a genocide, but the idea of a bystander really hit home. And we spent a lot of time reflecting on that. And I think that reflection was really what made me come to the decision, really by the time, it was probably just my final semester of senior year where I decided that's not me, I just don't want to be that person. And that's what set me on the path. Unfortunately, because I sort of figured that out my senior year and had not been involved in a lot of human rights activities when I was at Duke, I had to take the time to go to law school to sort of establish myself and sort of more of a background and resume, which ended up being a great step for me, not at all necessary to work in human rights. But I ended up going to law school, and that gave me a lot of time to really get more directly involved in human rights issues. And then I've never looked back since then. So that's my Duke story.
I guess I'll jump in if that's cool. Because I wanted to do the same thing, merge numbers 2 and 4. Because Duke was absolutely huge for me in terms of setting me on the path to be a human rights professional. When I came into Duke, I did not have the vision that I was going to dedicate my professional career to human rights. And by the time I left Duke, that was my conclusion. And when I was applying to law school, we're all lawyers, but at some point we should totally discuss that. But when I applied to law school, I said to them, well, I'm applying to you to be a human rights lawyer, and if you let me in, I'm going to take all the human rights courses. And that happened during my time here. I think it was my first semester sophomore year, but if I'm wrong, none of you will know. Robin might know, but she won't remember. Robin, you won't remember whether it was freshman or sophomore year.
But I can look it up.
Yeah, that's true. I held one event raising money for Darfur, the genocide, and then when that happened, several other people came to me and said, we heard that you're a Darfur guy. We want to do a Darfur event too. And then so I worked with them, and we started this organization called the Darfur Coalition, and then other people reached out to me and others and said, we heard you're the Darfur people, we're the Burma people, we want to do something very similar. And so we did something with them, and other people reached out to us and said, we heard you're the Darfur and the Burma people, we want to do this human rights thing. And I think I still try to figure out how to articulate this, but I learned a lesson then that kind of sticks with me to this day, which is that when you step into a space, others will often kind of be excited to move with you into that space. And once you kind of once you do a single event, and once you begin to self-identify as someone who has these concerns, others will gravitate towards you because they share the concerns. And that to me was really demonstrative of the idea that, okay, if I'm interested in engaging on a certain issue, I should do it, and others who share similar concerns will join me, or I will join them. The story I tell a lot about what crystallized my experience, my decision to become a human rights professional, was when we had a set of Burmese monks shortly after the Saffron Revolution in 2007 come to talk here at Duke, and they stayed around here for a few days, and I was one of several people who worked on making that happen. But when they were about to leave, I was sitting down with the abbot. His name is U Phienya Zauta. He had been jailed from 1990 to 2000 for his participation in the 1988 democracy protests, and he was one of the leaders of the 2007 protests and then fled the country so that he wouldn't be arrested again. And I was about to say to him, we were communicating through a translator. To this day, my Burmese is terrible. We were communicating through a translator, and I was about to say to him, is there anything else I can do for you? And the translator stopped me and said, U Phienya Zauta has a question for you. He wants to ask if there's anything else he can do for you. And I reflect on that moment all the time, because this is someone who, who had fled for his life, and here I was thinking I was doing him a favor by being a 21-year-old, arranging a space for him to talk, and he was right that, he was kind of doing me the favor by showing up and allowing me to spend time with him and to receive his understanding and knowledge and to hear from him. And that helped me kind of click into place some ideas about the old quote that's often quoted by the Aboriginal Collective, which is, if you're here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you're here because you realize that your liberation is bound up in our own, then let us work together. And that, for me, here at Duke, was a moment that crystallized that understanding for me and helped set me on a path where I thought, this is something in which I have passion for and I'm interested in. I'd like to explore if I can do this for the rest of my life.
For me, I graduated in 2007. When I came here, I'd come from Bosnia in 1992 to Durham. Duke gave my dad a job, and we were kind of Duke bound ever since. And in my first semester, I took a class with Claudia Kuntz, and that class, this is 2003, right? So it was fall of 2003. And at that time, Claudia, how many years removed were we from the Nazi Conscience being published? 2 or 3, and
Robin can check it.
yeah.
Robin's become the fact checker.
And the Nazi Conscience is a book I've gone back to twice in my life for kind of a full reading. So it's just something as students you should check out and really give a thorough read to. And it has to do with this idea of the Nazis having the Nazis, as in National Socialist movement and their followers, having embedded within them a very well, meticulously developed moral code that was developed over a number of years. And it was an extremely hard thing to teach to a young person. We were just speaking to Robin Kirk, and I were just speaking about this, right? Because I think Claudia always felt, and I'm stealing Robin's words now, right? That she didn't want to make us lose hope so early in our lives. How can this be a moral code? How can it just not be an aberration? But the hope lied in the fact that this is a process that takes a lot of time. And by the time you get to 1933, you've had, 15 years of radicalization. You have 15 years of history. And in each of those points, on every day that you wake up during those 15 years, there's an opportunity to act. By the time you get to 1943 and Bonhoeffer writes his, 10 years on letters, it's a different story, but in 1933, certainly, there's still a lot of hope. So that class, not only did it teach me to write well and taught me that I had a strong voice, which is the most you can ask for when you're 18, but I became, like Karen, very afraid of not being an actor, right? Of being a bystander. And I kept on thinking about what Claudia said, and I'm sorry to lay it on thick, Professor Phillips. But she had this thing she had to say. She'd say, go to your next Cameron Crazies game, and when everybody else stands up to cheer, sit down. Stay sitting. Stay sitting. How difficult is that? Now, the lesson there is not, sitting down is hard, or opposite, standing up and everybody sits is hard, but it's really, on the one hand, it conveys this feeling. It conveys the feeling of being, quote unquote, brave or being someone that acts with conviction. And then in it is embedded this lesson, just in that image and feeling that you kind of experience, that conviction means little without consistency. Because to sit in that moment, you have to know what you're about and you have to know how to move forward. Long story short, I was also involved with Darfur. I think I organized, in 2004, I was organizing kind of Darfur sit-ins on the grass, and I think you picked up on that work. I'm starting to remember that. And we organized Millennium Promise, which is this $1.5 million fundraising campaign my senior year here. And then I left for China because I thought the economy was great. It was 2007, and I thought I'd come back to a consulting job. And I ended up staying in China for a few years. And my first 10 years of my career, apart from going to law school, were really about learning how to build organizations. Because, and this is for another question, but I learned that the way to sustainable human rights work, there are multiple models, and one of them is by building organizations that have an economic engine that can allow you to do some of this other work that doesn't pay because people can't pay. And that's how I got here. But I'll stop there because we have a lot of questions.
Thank you. What do you see as the greatest current challenges in your fields, and how do you envision these issues evolving in the future?
I think there's challenges on multiple levels. So at least one that I would mention is that, actually I think James explained it pretty well, is that a lot of the energy that goes into supporting human rights is sometimes directed in such a way that it doesn't build in the action and energy of those who are most affected by whatever human rights abuse is being worked on. And despite the fact that I think that's improved over the last 150 years of, missionary movements and the types of sort of colonial type of movements that have gone in thinking, well, we have all the answers on how to help you. We've gotten somewhere from there, but I still am very surprised, and I'm sure I'm guilty of it myself at times, but still, it's very important to be conscious of it, because the idea that you can come in from the outside and have energy and support to give is very good, but the idea that you have the solution rather than the people who are most affected being the greatest experts on what is affecting them and how it can be solved. I'm still surprised how often I see that. And whether it's something small like a panel, recently in my area, a panel was organized to discuss the experiences of women, incarcerated women. And the three panelists who were originally planned were 3 states' attorneys. So that unfortunately, and that's in a relatively progressive area, or one that imagines itself to be a relatively progressive area. So those types of things I think are problematic. So that's just on sort of a practical level type of challenge that I think we're still facing, at least in the United States, whether we're dealing with human rights issues in the U.S. or overseas. The question is about challenges, but I may have no right to be an optimist, but I tend to really be an optimist and see dramatic changes that have taken place, whether we look on a 20-year time frame or a 50-year time frame. And it is really helpful to look on a 300 and a 600-year time frame of how respect for human life has evolved over the course of that time period and the dramatic improvements that have taken place. The types of crime. I work in the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice, and the section that I work in prosecutes human trafficking crimes, hate crimes, and police abuses. And there, of course, there are some very horrible crimes we prosecute, but the types of crimes, not as much on the human trafficking side, but on the hate crime side, it's not at all to say that there aren't horrible crimes, but the frequency of those types of crimes and the severity compared to 40 years ago or 80 years ago in the United States is not something that we should lose sight of, because it's very easy when you just look in the present to feel overwhelmed with all the terrible things that are happening. But in many parts of the world, with dramatic exceptions, in many parts of the world, and I believe in the United States, there's actually over the longer time frame been a lot of improvements. So, and I do think that points to another challenge, which is, it's related to what we talked about already, the bystander, is that for a lot of people who aren't involved in the day-to-day work of human rights, whether they call it human rights or not, but there are many social justice movements that are bound up in human rights. For those who aren't involved in it day-to-day, it's very easy to feel that things are okay and that we don't have to act. And so that is an ongoing challenge, is how to motivate people to both see the human rights abuses that are taking place and become involved in, whether it's just through their choice of how they cast their vote or some type of more intensive activity, how to get more people involved in supporting this progress. There are so many challenges, so I won't belabor those.
You mind if we switch?
Go for it.
All right. I think, if you don't mind, I'll take just a minute to kind of describe my work to contextualize the answer. Right? So I have this law firm, but I work with Me Malakteen, and that is a Durham-based nonprofit. We're about a $500,000 organization. And that's very new for this area to have that sort of, those sorts of resources at your disposal. And our goal is to leverage technology to create a bigger, to scale up the impact of immigration defense within detention centers in the South. So here in the South, we had a big victory in November, which got rid of 3 what are called 287G counties. Those are counties that have agreements with Immigration Customs Enforcement, ICE, to transfer any immigrants who have an immigration history that triggers an ICE arrest to ICE, no questions asked, within 48 hours. We got rid of 3 of them. Durham is no longer a 287G county. If you didn't know you lived in one, you do now, right? Wake County is no longer a 287G county. That's Raleigh, Cary, and Mecklenburg and Charlotte no longer is. That doesn't mean they don't cooperate with ICE, but it's a big step. Where our biggest project currently is in Charleston, South Carolina. So there in January started a transfer of immigrants from the San Diego entry point, the San Diego Tijuana entry point, of people seeking asylum. Suddenly there were these big transfers of folks, 212 between December 25th and December 28th to Charleston, which is just a local jail. And it had a contract with ICE for 256 beds that they would rent to them. Up until January, at most you'd have a dozen transfers from our kind of southern detention centers in Stuart, Georgia, Folkston, Irwin, the world of immigration. These are kind of notorious names. Detention centers are like concentration camps, but with a better name. And that presented a crisis, these 200-some transfers. It's a crisis because Charleston did not have the infrastructure, and we knew this very quickly, to put in place some basic due process protections for these transferees from San Diego who were all seeking asylum. For example, they're supposed to have orientation organizations on the ground who come in and say, hey, you are asking for asylum. This is what that means. This is what the process looks like. They didn't have any sort of telephone system inside of these facilities that would allow people to contact their sponsors, or to even, they didn't have a system to let them know their sponsors where they were. Sponsors are people within the United States, legal permanent residents or U.S. citizens, who can say, hey, if this person gets parole, receives parole because they're eligible for asylum, I'll take them in. So for myself, my co-founder Athenas, and our kind of partner groups, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and then Innovation Law Lab, this presented a big problem. We have been building out the set of detention center projects all across the South to provide free pro bono services to people that are in removal proceedings. But that's for what are called interior arrests. Okay, so you have a family, you've been here for 10 years, you're going to work, you get pulled over, no license, you get arrested, put in 287G County, ICE takes you in. These are the stories that you hear about. But this presented a new challenge. This is the challenge that I'm seeing. Okay, so we had to come in knowing that we had three stakeholders that were going to be in opposition to us. One is ICE, one is USCIS, Citizenship Immigration Services, who complete the interviews for asylum seekers, and one is the local law enforcement agency, in this case the jail and the police force. They were going to be in opposition to us. As a one-on-one pro bono lawyer, that's a really tough situation to be, right? If you're like a traditional one-on-one pro bono model. Because it's you and maybe your 2 or 3 clients out of 200 against these agencies that are big data, big network, big money, and big political power organizations. ICE was founded in 2001, right? USCIS went into the Department of Homeland Security in the same year. Every year since then, they've become more digitized, they've started collecting more data, they're integrated with more networks. ICE can track license plates. In fact, they use private license plate databases to track immigrants and you, right, wherever you go. The biggest challenge that we have is how do we fight back against that? And our answer, what we call big immigration law, is to quickly be able to scale up wherever there are these kind of big masses of people where due process rights are at risk. To be able to scale up to ourselves become big data, big network, big resource organizations. And to do that, fundamentally, you can't go in saying, I'm going to help and change everything. Fundamentally, you have to go in on the ground and say, who's here? And what are you doing? Here's what I have. Here's the theory I have. Can we do this together? Fundamentally, you have to integrate technology, right? And you have to be network-based. In 3 months, we were able to represent 400 people in credible fear proceedings with an initial team of 3. Credible fear proceedings are the fear proceedings that is the exam you sort of have to pass to actually be able to apply for asylum. And we did that employing this model. I believe that the biggest challenge for human rights practitioners the world over, in the face of growing AI, which I think can only help authoritarian countries get stronger, in the face of larger databases, which can only make it easier to track us, to curtail rights, and in my field, an ever-growing humanitarian catastrophe of sorts, where the southern world is coming to the northern world because of climate change, because of war, is the need to be able to scale up. And it's an interdisciplinary approach. It's not about call-out culture, it's not about representing one-on-one, it's about scaling up organizations quickly. Sorry, that was a lot. I think you need the context, otherwise it wouldn't make sense.
Greatest current challenges in my field. Well, you know, I to this day, the majority of my remit is with international human rights work, and you know, one example I think of is after law school, I did a year of research talking to civil society groups about the developing regional human rights system in Southeast Asia, which has essentially been systematically designed not to function, because it's the governments that created the regional human rights system, and it's the governments that have the most interest in making sure it doesn't work. You know, so when one thinks about the concept of international human rights, I think from inception, the greatest challenge is the fact that the very parties tasked with safeguarding human rights are the very parties that most often are the perpetrators of human rights violations. And when I was doing that research, I was talking to a lot of NGOs and human rights advocates who had no confidence that they would see any meaningful results from this human rights body. The only people who were optimistic in any way were the academics, the ones who can say, well, going back from 1998, we're much further, 15 years later than we were then. They were the only ones who were really optimistic. I think that with international human rights, and I suppose domestic human rights as well, you do have to be comfortable to a certain extent banging your head against the wall. And that's in tension with the fact that you always need to be searching for the door. Perfect metaphor. Killed it, James. Good work. Which is to say that, one of the, I'm anticipating a later question, but certainly if I could talk to Duke University 21-year-old me, my biggest advice to myself would be like, spend more time thinking about what you're asking for, what are the pressure points, what are your actual advocacy strategies and targets, rather than just kind of yelling about an injustice. While at the same time, I would say, given that, the greatest current challenge in some ways, just the fact that you're yelling at large institutions such as governments or large multinational corporations that really feel incentivized not to respond to human rights concerns, whether it be because of capital, whether it be because of government policy, et cetera. So it's always interesting and hard to figure out when the fact that you've been banging your head against the wall means that it's not working, and when the fact that you've been banging your head against the wall means you just need to keep banging your head against the wall, right? We had one win that I think about a lot that occurred middle of last year, which was when the Chinese poet Liu Xia was released from 8 years of house arrest and was finally allowed to leave the country, right? That's 8 years of advocacy organizations around the world just kind of banging the drum without significant confidence that that drum banging would result in meaningful change in the near term. But it was sustained advocacy that helped us get there. And that's a strange thing to do. The people who worked on those campaigns 8 years ago, many of them have transitioned on different organizations or different projects, right? They never, they're alive, but they didn't get to see their advocacy translate into results in a way that had a short time frame or in a way that could viscerally relate to what they were doing back then. But that's the work that needed to be done. You just bang the drum, bang the drum, bang the drum, and keep that steady drumbeat of pressure on. And that's one of the ways that you respond to the greatest current challenge in the field, which is that to be a human rights practitioner is often to be up against very powerful entities that feel very little incentive to change their behavior.
Thank you. In the interest of time, yes.
Sorry, so I agree to an extent. I don't think banging the drum is enough.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are, like Liu Xia, I think he also had cancer, right?
Liu Xiaobo had cancer.
Liu Xiaobo.
That's the husband of Liu Xiaobo.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things. I think there was a public outcry on Chinese media. Full disclosure, I work with Kaiser Kuo and Sub China, so he works out of my office. So,
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
Tell Kaiser I say hi.
Yeah.
Inside baseball, that's what happens
Yeah.
if you become a human rights practitioner. You get to do cool stuff like this.
Yeah, so he's, I think you have to have a really good sense of what it is that you're beating, right? And sometimes beating the drum is just not enough, and it's sort of like being the survivor of a shipwreck, in the 1500s. You come out, you're like, thank God, God is great, I survived. So what about the 190 other souls that did? What happened to them? And then that's what it sometimes feels like to be a successful human rights practitioner, right? That's beat the drum long enough, and you have a victory. But is there a cause and effect? It's not always clear. I think what is clear to me is that data is changing the human rights field in a new way, right? We can now get data, for example, when you write petitions to the FCC, right? I don't know if any of you followed this. This is big on Reddit and all these kind of other social media. The FCC itself wrote a bunch of fake petitions saying that internet privacy wasn't important, right? And somebody was able to actually pull a Freedom of Information Act and see that a lot of these things were fake, and we were able to get data about how many were fake, how many were right. With that data, you can go to court. You don't have to beat the drum of advocacy, right? At least in the United States, right? We can challenge in a very real way and get injunctions. We can take that data and get money into political campaigns and move these political actors out of the way, right? So I want to, and I know you're not saying this, right? It's just there's a level of sophistication there that you can get past, right, as you become professionals, right, when you move from being just actors to leaders, right? That's not just beating the drum. I'm not trying to
No,
make
I agree with your disagreement of my point.
Okay. I want to point out one more thing, which is there's two men on this panel, and I've never, in all of my immigration career, right, human rights career, been on a panel where there's two men. It is women-led, and I just had my second girl 2 days ago, so I'm just, that's not why I'm aware of this. That's like the match defense. Right. But, yeah.
Thank you. I think we're just going to open up for audience questions now, in the interest of time.
You in the back.
Yeah.
I had a question, Mr. Noble. Recently, the New York Times produced an article on the ethics of AI, and where the implication of constantly streaming human beings. What is your opinion?
Sure. There's, I didn't read that. I read a couple of months ago, Atlantic had a cover story on what AI might mean for a number of different things. The story that sticks with me, and the way that I've started to think about it in our work, is that AI is a lot more apt, knowing what we know about it. We know that it can concentrate a lot of power in a very small place. We know that it can modify behavior very quickly. Right? The ads that you see on your phones after you talk or after you search something are in many ways now deep think powered, right? So whether you're talking about Baidu's AI or you're talking about Google's AI. And so where does the concentration of power favor a democratic system of government, not democratic people or society, democratic system of government, or an authoritarian one? Well, probably an authoritarian one, if I had to bet on it. And I'm looking at following the story of China's social credit system, which you might not know about, you should read about. It's really interesting. This idea that their Amazon equivalent and their Google equivalent, which is like basically one company, imagine if our Amazon, Google, and Apple and the government came together and they said, we're going to pool our data and we're going to come up with these rankings for people based on where they shop, how many times they search online for porn, who their friends are on their social networks, and some other stuff we're not going to tell anybody. And that's going to be their social credit score, and that's going to be tied to the amount of loans they can get. It's going to be tied to in-app purchases and apps. So if you have like a low social credit score and you want to rent a scooter, it's $3. If you have a high one, it's free. AI is going to make that more powerful. And it's going to change the way we behave. Already in China, we see people choosing their friends online based on their perceived social credit score. So I personally think that one way we can fight this, if we're talking about having hope, right, and fighting up until that 1933 moment, we need to democratize AI, right? I don't think we should stop it. I'm not the sort of person that thinks we should dismantle nuclear power plants either, right? So that I might be conservative in that way. But personally, I would love to have access as an immigration practitioner who relies on a lot of data to like Microsoft's AI infrastructure. Like all these commercials that are like Carlsberg beer. We can now create beer in 30 seconds. I love to be like, I can create a bond motion in 25 seconds. I've created 1,000 bond motions in 3 minutes. I've pissed off 75,000 ICE officers in an hour. Right? I would love to have that sort of capability. But we have to become active in it because it's here. It's not 10 years from now, it's now.
I mean, I totally agree. I think it's really highly relevant to bring back to the points that were just made, where it's like that's not just something that's happening out there, quote unquote. It's something happening here, and that the ICE being able to track license plates, I think, is a great example of that here in the United States context. And of course, I just want to mention, if you're thinking about what AI and technological advances mean, the social credit system in China is important to look at, but of course also Xinjiang in Western China, where credible reports of more than 1 million ethnic minority members are currently interned. We're seeing things such as QR codes being put on people's homes so that they can scan it and see what the relationship with the inhabitants is with the government. We're seeing things like Wi-Fi sniffers, which can sniff out IP addresses and who's talking to whom. So that's another manifestation of how new technological advances, favor, in some ways, seem to favor autocratic systems.
The area that I've spent the last 12 or so years working in is on human trafficking, and this is a crime that tends to be, not always, but very much tends to be hidden. It's not apparent right away when you see someone, and even that person might not identify themselves as a victim of human trafficking, but it's a person who's been forced or coerced, or in some cases lured or deceived into providing labor or services or commercial sex. And very often this happens in very isolated places. I started off talking about a fisher on a long line vessel in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which happens, and folks can be out there for months at a time without getting paid, working 20 hours a day. And it happens in rural brick kilns in remote areas of India or Nepal. So what we've seen is that artificial intelligence also has, what we need is that the smart people come over to the good side. So thank goodness you all are interested. But there are ways that some of these more hidden types of abuses can actually be assisted by artificial intelligence. So for example, identifying what type of vessel with what type of characteristics are they engaged in transshipment in the middle of the sea, how long are people on deck, and then connecting those characteristics to identified cases of forced labor is actually shown in very small scale pilots that we definitely need to scale up, but the technology is potentially there to use artificial intelligence for positive as well. And of course, there's potentially very negative uses of artificial intelligence. As we look back on history, extraordinarily autocratic governments, extremely abusive governments have been able to exercise totalitarian control without artificial intelligence also. So while it does give them new creative avenues in order to exercise that type of abuse, it's certainly not necessary. So, like I said before, I think I tend to be more on the optimistic side, but I think we just want to direct those types of human capacities, which in and of themselves don't have a moral value. They're just tools that we can use for good or bad.
Thank you. I think we're almost out of time. Oh, yes, of course, go for it.
I can't leave this on the ground. The lawyer question.
Don't do it.
Yeah. But because I came into human rights at a different generation where it was a vocation as much as anything else.
Yeah.
And Human Rights Watch, a bunch of us were not lawyers.
Yes.
But now it seems like that has become more the norm. So I just want to
Well, I'd be happy to address that because I have not used my law license. So if there's a type of work you want to do where you need a license, obviously go to law school, and there's wonderful things you can do with that. But most of the jobs I've had, I've used it very little. In other words, I haven't practiced law. I have practiced law, but very little in actually immigration representation for trafficking victims in the United States. But all of the other jobs I've had, even now as a policy counsel at the Department of Justice, they require me to have a law degree because it's just it's actually not necessary to do my job. So what I have found is that it has definitely been helpful, but most of the work that I've done, I easily could see that someone with who had done some study of the law, but not necessarily spending 3 years on an expensive law degree, and have other historian background in history, journalism, so many other backgrounds, cultural studies. I mean, so many types of backgrounds that can be helpful in human rights. I'm glad that I have a law degree because it's been helpful to me. But at every step of the way, I've said, wow, I really could do this job without a law degree also. So I would encourage people to go to law school if either there's a type of job you would like to do where you need to have a law license. And so, you want to be in court, for example, you want to be in immigration court, or you want to be litigating, then some of that work is so important. Or if you just are interested in that study, and that was more me. I didn't think I was going to practice, but I was just very interested in the law and how it can be used as a tool. But I would not go to law school because you think you kind of need to, because you just don't, and there's so many other things you can do. So if your heart is really saying, I really want a master's in political science, or I'd rather spend 2 years studying, medieval history. There's a lot you can learn about the world by studying medieval history, surprisingly, about just humanity and what makes us human versus what makes us, 21st century Americans in North Carolina. So I would definitely advocate just follow your heart. And that goes for choosing law school and also for choosing what jobs you take and what direction you go in. You absolutely do not need a law degree to study human rights, and do it if you want to. And if you kind of don't want to, or your parents are pressuring you, or you think you need it to make money, you don't.
Yeah, I similarly am a non-practicing attorney, and I've most of my work experience, I haven't needed a law degree. Even when I was with the International Commission of Jurists, I obviously was not able to practice law in Burma or Thailand or Cambodia. So I was talking about legal norms, even though that was a situation where I was required to have a law degree because the word jurist is in the title. I think that, but I know that a law degree has helped me a lot professionally in that immediately coming to the table, people presume, hopefully correctly, that I have a certain delineated expertise that is more specific than just an expertise in human rights. My biggest advice to people who are considering careers in the human rights field, I would say, is figure out what expertise you will have within the field of human rights that is more specific and deep than merely I will have an expertise in human rights. Because if you are going into that career, many times you will be in a room with many other people who will also be human rights practitioners or advocates, human rights or civil rights or related systems. And in that situation, you want to be able to say, okay, here is my specific expertise as a person within that room, and here is the expertise I bring to bear to these conversations. For me, going into law has helped me do that, but it's certainly not the only way to do it.
For our project in the detention centers, and most of the detention work nationwide is done by professional organizers who aren't lawyers. The most significant work going on at the border in Tijuana and Mexicali and some of the eastern locations is all led by non-lawyers. And in fact, most of the impact litigation work that you hear about that gets a lot of press, those are lawyers, but they couldn't do their work without the non-lawyers that are on the ground. That being said, there's a question here. Sometimes it seems like many people around us are choosing careers for money, right? So there's a money question here that can be scary, and I think it's scary, if I'm remembering being 22, just knowing how do you go forth in a career. And you have to know what your frame is, right? What constructs limit the choices you can make? Because choices aren't limitless, right? So going into college, I knew I could go to college where I didn't have to pay tuition, right? Because we were poor, right? Coming out of college, I didn't have debt because I didn't have to pay tuition. And so I was like, well, now I have more choices. Leaving law school, I had debt again. So now I had fewer choices, right? And that's just a realistic part. Most nonprofits who work human rights, when you enter, it's an unpaid position, or it's paid at $10 to $15 an hour no matter what city you're in. And you have to know that going in. And most of the jobs that you, if I'm saying something, Robin, that's not true, in my experience.
Bring it on.
And most of the jobs, as you climb the impact scale, right? So where you have power, and what does power mean? Power means that you have the ability to change something, right? The more power you have, the more ability you have to change. And that usually means because you have more people that can kind of work with you. As you climb the impact scale, your pay will go up. If you get a law degree, your pay will go up a little more, assuming you've been in that field. But your debt might be higher. So it's kind of like a wash, right? For me, what the JD does is that I think if I didn't have a JD, I wouldn't have been invited here today. I think. Because I probably wouldn't have been able to start a law firm that gave me the freedom to start a nonprofit. And the reason I can start a law firm is because I have a certificate that gives me a monopoly on a legal service. Right? It's a guild. So I would say, if you want to go into human rights law, go to medical school. I'm just joking. That's a joke. That's a joke. But in a serious note, whatever you do, plan to stick with it for a while. It took me 10 years to figure out how to build organizations. And I went to law school when I was like 28. Right? So I knew what I wanted to do going in. So plan to stick with it. And everything else might be fine. It might not be, but you'll get over it. And failing is okay. Because most of this, what we do, we fail all the time. Okay?
Thank you. That's all the time we have left for the panel, but please join me in giving a round of applause to our amazing alumni panelists. Now I'll invite Ibby up to present the Student Research Slam.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ibrahim Budd. I'm a member of the Duke Human Rights Student Advisory Board. I want to begin by, again, thanking the panelists for traveling back to Duke and sharing some of their stories with us. It's refreshing to realize that, you can still do human rights even after you graduate. And I'm just excited by some of the stories that they told. If anyone has any more questions, please feel free to ask them afterwards. I'm sure they'll be more than happy to share some more of their stories. We'll now be moving on to the Research Slam of the component of Global Impact Local Festival. It's one of my favorite parts of this event because we get to highlight some of the cool research that students, undergraduates and graduate students are doing on this campus. Sometimes you don't get to hear about that. Sometimes research is hidden. So I really like exposing people's research and, seeing what the cool stuff that people are doing on campus. The Research Slam is quick and fast. A lot of the times it can be a bit hectic, but hopefully in this event, we'll keep it much more mellow. It's students have 2.5 minutes to present their research, the main themes of their research, their thesis, some of their findings, and just really recognize why their research is important and what it's doing to contribute towards human rights. We have 8 students for you today. I've read some of their titles. Their research sounds so cool. I wish I could have done it as well. But without further ado, we can start off with our first presenter, which is Kenzie. So Kenzie, go for it.
Hi everyone, my name is Kenzie Cook. I'm working on a group partnership, it's a Basque Connections class, called Duke Acre Partnership to Improve Sanitation in Lowndes County, Alabama. I was originally inspired to join this project because I took my first ever human rights class a year ago with Robin Kirk, and she had Catherine Flowers, who is the founder and do-it-all woman of the Alabama Center for Rural Enterprise. So this project really focuses on the human right to clean water and sanitation. And as a Basque Connections class, it's a multidisciplinary approach. We have a technology team, a mapping team, a team that looks at policy. I personally work on the timeline team, which is, it tracks the history of environmental justice across the United States. Last semester we wrote event descriptions for big environmental justice events in the US, and this semester we've been doing work interviewing activists across the country on their work, because we really feel that these are stories that need to be told. I think it's one thing to read about Hurricane Florence and another thing to watch an interview with somebody who lived through Hurricane Florence. Just last week we were at the climate reality training in Atlanta, and we were able to interview so many incredible activists such as Dr. Robert Bullard, who wrote the first textbook on environmental justice, and Cherie Foytlin, who is an indigenous activist and really cool lady. So please look out for our project. I think the Basque Connections is presenting mid-April. I think it's April 10th, Emily? Not quite sure. 17th. But that's what we've been doing.
That sounds like one of the coolest Basque Connections projects. Should have joined. I think our next presenter is Sonali, and I've seen her present before on this, and it's one of the most inspiring research projects I've seen, so I'm really excited for it.
Okay. Hi, my name's Sonali. I'm a junior. Last semester, I had the opportunity to study abroad in Chile, Nepal, and Jordan, along with Ibi, actually. I was in each country for about 5 weeks. We were taking classes, learning about human rights. I also did this research project about sexual violence. So I was really interested in sexual violence, specifically as it occurs at the university level, and specifically the disclosure of it. So when do survivors decide to talk about it? Who do they talk about it to? And what happens because of that? So I did over 30 interviews with stakeholders, so students, faculty members, government officials, and then non-governmental grassroots organizers working in this space. And I basically came to 3 main conclusions. First, the way that sexual violence is dealt with in a period of conflict really matters for today's generation of sexual violence survivors. So in Chile, after the Pinochet dictatorship, in Nepal, after the Maoist insurgency, the way those things were handled, whether or not there was testimony or a foundation set up for survivors to talk about the violence during that conflict, really affects whether or not students are able to talk about it today. Second, the emergence of public disclosure. So that's something that I was able to connect directly to the Me Too movement. Students are looking for more and more opportunities to speak up about what's happened to them and also name their perpetrators publicly. So whether that means on the internet or students in Chile have organized kind of a public forum where you can come forward with your stories. And finally, non-disclosure. So in all 3 countries across the board, speaking out is still a very difficult thing to do. In every country, people cited fear of victim blaming and shame as the main 2 reasons that they were unwilling to come forward with their experiences of sexual violence. So I think that's really important to keep in mind as we move forward and try to create a world without sexual violence.
Yeah, after a long day in Kathmandu, Nepal, I would be like, I'm going home, and I'd ask Sonali where she's going, and she'd be going to interview another activist or a university professor, and I would just feel like, wow, okay, cool. I think next we have Hannah, one of our co-chairs, who will present.
Hi, I'm Hannah. This was an essay I wrote that won the Coons Prize last year on female genital mutilation and cutting, which I will refer to as FGMC. It includes all procedures that involve partial or total removal of the external female genitalia for non-medical reasons. And it causes immense physical, psychological, and sexual trauma. But more than just the health adverse effects of that, it also violates women's rights, their bodily autonomy. And so it's also a very difficult issue to address because it's deeply embedded in social, cultural, and moral religious norms and traditions. So efforts to end the practice have to be very collective and communal because women get ostracized if they don't. And so what I did was I looked at 3 different types of approaches and looking at case studies for each. So the first was legislation in Egypt. And what I found was like it can't be top down because if it's just top down, it kind of is seen as imposing Western beliefs and practices, and it has to be accompanied by kind of more local level efforts, public awareness campaigns, collaborations with local leaders, and the main goal is to provide framework and symbolic support for local efforts. Another method is education programming, and I looked at the Tostone Community Empower programs, and it's really important that education programs are centered on human rights and not just health effects, because educating on health leads just to the medicalization of the practice, in which the procedure is done with doctors and in hospitals. And so culturally sensitive programming, using the village's languages, using village's stories and values, and curriculum centered on human rights and giving women the agency to decide are really important for kind of the communal education aspect. Another strategy is a positive deviance approach. I looked at a case study in Egypt as well, in which you identify individuals who chose to deviate from the practice. This could be women who did not get who did not undergo the procedure, parents who decided not to have their children undergo the procedure, and men who decided to marry women who did not undergo the procedure. And from that, it's basically understanding that the resources for kind of providing that education are within the community. And so basically overall, I found that kind of the combination of these 3 efforts are the best strategy. Efforts and FGMC must be led by local community members and leaders rooted in human rights and empowerment, agreed upon collectively as a village, and supported by state policies and resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. I think we have Jerry next.
Hi everyone, my name is Jair. I'm a cultural anthropology major. I'm a senior writing a thesis. My thesis discusses a legal strategy, a procedure that was created in 2005 by the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice, and it was seen as a solution to an uptick in border crossers in a post-9/11 era. It was justified by the goals of border security and deterrence, and my argument overall is that it does neither of these things effectively, and it has to end immediately. Operation Streamline is a court procedure that processes 45 to 70 undocumented immigrants all at once. They're sitting all together in a courtroom, shackled, and within the hour, defendants will accept plea deals and leave with misdemeanors or felonies on a criminal record. The majority of these defendants have no prior criminal history, and they're convicted and sentenced for the act of illegal entry or re-entry. The process happens every weekday in border states across the U.S. I'm not saying that the U.S. shouldn't participate in border security and acknowledge the issues that occur on the border, but we already have separate processes for dealing with actual security threats and nonviolent border crossers. Using Streamline places nonviolent offenders through the criminal justice system instead of the civil immigration system. And having a criminal history complicates legal access to citizenship later on, and it bars access to asylum. The lawyers are interviewed for this project note that it's frustrating and often futile to fight these cases. You can't win a case for illegal entry when your client was apprehended crossing the border. So Streamline is successful in criminalizing migration, but my question is for what? It costs billions of taxpayer dollars to run these court procedures, to hire the personnel and incarcerate them, and it's mostly for the profit of private prisons. The historical connections between prison lobbyists and the politicians that craft these tougher immigration policies is also quite evident. And it's all to achieve the same outcome of deportation. It's an unnecessary intermediary step. My conclusion is that we have to reallocate resources to real border security issues, or to create immigration policies that respect nonviolent border crossers, to acknowledge that they come for necessary low-wage labor, to escape violence that the U.S. has caused in their home countries, or to reunite with their families. Criminalizing nonviolent border crossers does nothing for our national security. Thanks.
Thank you, Jair. Should be moving on to one of my good friends, Kevin, who will be presenting on issues in Durham County.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kevin Solomon. I'm a junior studying political science and human rights. I'm from St. Petersburg, Florida. My research looks at the intersection between cities and social justice. So this semester, under the supervision of yours truly, Robin Kirk, co-director of the DHRC at FHI, I'm researching the state of reentry housing in Durham County. So specifically, I'm looking to ascertain what are the policies and/or programs that we need to ensure that everyone who returns from prison has decent housing when they do. So last year, the Durham Innovation Team reported that in 2016, approximately 746 individuals returned from state prison in 2016. And housing and employment are consistently noted as two of the most important things for ensuring stability and therefore reducing recidivism afterwards. So given my personal experiences with housing insecurity and my dad's imprisonment, as well as my advocacy here in Durham as a community organizer with the Durham Community Land Trustees for Affordable Housing, I decided to weave together these two things to conduct an ethnography to understand what are the policies that we can create so that we can ensure a better future for these individuals. So next year, working with State Senator Floyd McKissick, I'm going to be conducting my senior thesis proposing these policies and implementing them. And this year, and setting the foundation for that. So through ethnography with Department of Public Safety officials, state and county policymakers, nonprofit providers like TROSA, which is a really famous substance abuse rehabilitator, I've come to understand that there are many, many ways in which our reentry systems fail individuals returning from prison. So specifically, a great example, around 40% of individuals who enter prison usually have housing when they do, but they lose it because they aren't connected with their families and their close partners who would maintain tenancy. So if we can expand home release programs so that individuals can maintain these connections throughout their incarceration and their sentence, you can improve retention so that individuals don't have to try to find new housing afterwards. They go back to the housing that they're from and where they're used to. So these are just some of the policies. I'd be happy to talk more afterwards, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Kevin. Next we have, that's me. We'll skip me. We'll come back to me at the end. I thought I was going at the end. We can go on to Isabel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Isabel Guttenplan. I'm a senior here at Duke in the Human Rights Certificate Program, and this is my capstone project that I'm working on right now. So my capstone project has two kind of main research questions. The first is, how did Duke's sexual misconduct policy, which right now is like a 14-page, very comprehensive policy, how did it develop, how did it start, how did it change, and also what I'm personally more interested in, why do things change the way they do, especially these types of policies. So Duke's sexual misconduct policy started in 1991 with just 2 bullet points that fell under the assault and battery code of the undergraduate judicial code and basically just defined what sexual assault was. Not going to go through all of the policy changes, but there are 5 main ones that I focused on. And kind of my conclusion, which I'm coming to now, which I thought was really interesting and I think can be applied to different types of campus activism as well, is that these types of changes really have to come from either administration wanting to do it themselves or more often student activism. And that the Duke Women's Center, while they were very important and influential in every single policy change, they didn't really have the power or capital to make the changes themselves. So when there was a change that they identified that they wanted to see happen and administration didn't want to, they really had to fan the flames of student activism or work very closely with student activists in order to make that happen, which I just think is really interesting in the larger question of like who has the power, but also who do the people in power listen to? Which, yeah, I think that's something that can be applied to these types of conversation on other campuses, but also other types of activism on our campus.
Thank you, Isabel. A very pertinent topic, especially on Duke's campus these days. I think we have Nora.
Hi, everyone. So I'm a 5th-year PhD student in the English department here at Duke. So when most people think of Mark Twain, classics such as Huck Finn probably come to mind. Eclipsed by his other work, King Leopold's Soliloquy, Twain's satirical pamphlet about human rights atrocities in the Belgian Congo, is often overlooked. But this text, I argue, deserves the sustained attention of both literary and human rights scholars. It can teach us how narratives and images shape and politicize collective understandings of mass violence. In order to better contextualize the text 1905 publication, last summer I visited UC Berkeley, home of the Mark Twain papers, with the support of an FHI research grant. Here are 3 lessons that I took from the archives. First, Twain insisted upon a multisensorial, multi-generic approach to storytelling. As I discovered, Twain's cryptic marginalia, scribbled on a 1904 report presented to the US Congress on the Congo Free State, supports this point. Twain wrote in the margins, quote, "I want some terrible illustrations." And with the advent of photographic technology, he found and included them. Second, Twain did not write the text in isolation, but was instead part of a larger network of activists and thinkers. These included his friend President Teddy Roosevelt, Dido Tway, a young Liberian activist, his secretary, Isabel Lyon, and E.D. Morrell, the British founder of the Liverpool-based Congo Reform Association. Third, Twain's extreme pendulum of emotions, from zealous optimism to bitter pessimism, is a study in the limitations and possibilities of literature to effect political change. For example, in private correspondence with the Liberian activist Dido Tway, Twain expressed his disillusionment with humanity, expounding that his correspondent would be better off making his case about Congo reform in the lion's cage at the zoo instead of to his fellow human beings. In conclusion, my visit to the archives helped to fill in some missing puzzle pieces about Twain's involvement with and eventual estrangement from the Congo Reform Association. Twain once said that a classic is something that everyone wants to have read, but nobody wants to read. Compared to Huck Finn, King Leopold's soliloquy certainly isn't a well-known classic. But by going by Twain's definition, maybe it's better that way. After all, he wanted people to actually pick up and read his pamphlet, to take political action against the Belgian monarch, and to change the world around them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nora. We can go back to me. I haven't presented on this since last semester when Sonali and I had to present on it for our final research paper, but my name is Ibrahim Budd. I'm a junior studying political science and also going for the human rights certificate. And last semester, I conducted ethnographic field research in Chile, Nepal, and Jordan. I personally wanted to study human rights violations related to citizenship and how nation states use the right to nationality to strip individuals of their human rights and abuse their human rights. Citizenship is particularly an important issue for me because, especially in post-colonial states across Africa and Asia, after the advent of colonialism, people were citizens of new states overnight. They didn't know which state they belonged to. They didn't know where they had their passport from. And this particular instance was really pertinent for my family too, because that was my father's experience. He was born in India before the partition of Pakistan and India. And over a course of a few days, him and his family moved from the depths of northern India into Pakistan. And for the first 18 years of his life, he wasn't a citizen of either country. He was a stateless individual. And he recounts the times where he couldn't get an education, he wasn't allowed to be employed in any services, he worked in the informal economy, and citizenship really defined his first 18 years of his life. Now, 6 years later, he's a proud British citizen. I'm from England, so he's done pretty well for himself. But I wanted to investigate how citizenship and how the right to nationality is abused by governments. So during my last semester, I traveled to Chile, Nepal, and Jordan studying the relationship between citizenship and human rights. I conducted more than 20 interviews with politicians, activists, and stateless individuals across my 3 countrysides. I met with Mapuche individuals in Chile who were trying to resist the Chilean state, trying to nationalize them and integrate them into their country. I met with Nepalese women who were protesting against the patriarchal citizenship laws there. I was able to meet with 2 of the most marginalized communities in the world. I was able to meet with the Rohingya individuals in Nepal, a stateless minority who the BBC have categorized as the most persecuted minority in the world. And I was able to meet with Palestinian activists in East Amman, Jordan, who yearn just for their statehood to be recognized and for them to return to their homes. Stateless communities were some of the most marginalized communities I've ever seen. They exist at the fringe of society with no protection according to national laws, and the international laws for them are very weak. So this made me question how are those international laws very weak, and how do individuals not have protection through their nation states? So just to finish off, my two key findings were that there's a contention between national and international law. International law takes supremacy over national law takes supremacy over international law, and governments that have signed up for the UN Conventions on Statelessness still don't have to implement them because their national law on citizenship takes precedent. So this was the case in Nepal, where the Rohingya individuals, facing ethnic cleansing and genocide, had a genuine case for refugee resettlement or asylum, and Nepal was not in the mood for giving them citizenship. My second finding was that in domestic situations, governments purposely strip the citizenship of individuals so that they don't have to provide them with human rights. We saw this in Jordan, where the Jordanian government now is starting to strip some of the citizenship of Palestinian Jordanians so they don't have to provide them with housing, economic benefits, because they are some of the most marginalized and poorest communities in Jordan. So citizenship is really a crucial and important topic for me, given the past, but also given the future of how citizenship is going to look and how governments have complete control of a citizenship and can rescind it to abuse the human rights of individuals. So yeah, that was my research topic, and I just want to say thank you for all the other researchers that came here to present. I really hope you got a wide breadth of the research that is happening at Duke on human rights. It's not just happening in the Human Rights Center, it's happening in the Sanford School, in the Nicholas School for Environment, and just try and get on those listservs, try and get on the Duke Human Rights Center listserv, because I know they have a lot of opportunities to engage in human rights and to engage in human rights fields that are necessarily not prominent. And also thank you to our panelists for coming out and sharing some of their information with us. I don't know if you guys want to finalize it or...
Yeah, we can have a final round of applause for everyone who's presented.
And yeah, thank you for coming out to Global Ideas Local Impact. We love this event, and we love that we could share it with you as well. Thank you.